And we're live. Take it away, Maya.
Hello, I'm Maya Rockymore Cummings, the president of Global Policy Solutions. I'm pleased to be host and to welcome you to this dynamic discussion of the Kerner Commission report and its relevance for those of us organizing for racial justice today. In the summer of 1967, 23 cities across the country erupted in protests, most of them sparked by responses to police actions in Black neighborhoods. Each eruption was like lighting a match to the already very dry tinder of inequality, injustice, denied opportunities, and growing frustration at the chasm between the seemingly bright promise of America's slogans and the dark reality in impoverished, segregated communities of color. At the end of that summer, entire neighborhoods in cities were smoldering in ruins. In Detroit, 43 people were killed. In Newark, 26 people were killed. If this were ancient history, we wouldn't be having this webinar today. Sadly, it isn't. The Schott Foundation has invited our panelists and our viewers to look deeply at the Kerner Commission report and into its significance for these dire times we live in. To start this conversation, I am pleased to turn to Dr. John Jackson, President and CEO of the Schott Foundation. Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Maya. Good afternoon, family. The Schott Foundation is celebrating our 30th anniversary. And with our partners and allies, we began this year with intensified focus on strategies for systemic change. Since my first occasion collaborating with Senator Fred Harris and Dr. Alan Curtis on healing our divided communities, a strategic effort to contextualize the recommendations from the 1968 Kerner Commission, I have been keenly aware that we have much to learn from the courageous truth-telling in the Kerner report. The report, issued barely a month before Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, dramatically moved him, so much so that he called it a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. More than 50 years later, it's painfully obvious that the policy prescriptions in the Kerner report were not delivered to communities most in need across the nation. And many of the indices of racial inequity have either stagnated or in some cases, like incarceration, increased in the past 5 decades. So we stand here more than 50 years later as a philanthropic, nonprofit, community, and governmental leaders in the midst of dual pandemic, living in a nation still in need of a prescription. We stand here more than 50 years later in a country going through a modern identity crisis, struggling to determine who we are while living in the vestiges of who we've been. More than 50 years later, we find ourselves at the intersection of more opportunity, more privilege, more innovation, and yet, unfortunately, more need and political divisions. As such, our purpose in this conversation today is to speak to friends, foes, and colleagues alike about the 3 major truths in the Kerner report, which today should be our collective fierce call to action. The first truth was the Commission's bold statement affirming the existence of structural racism in America. That truth coming not only from marchers or civil rights leaders, but from an official bipartisan commission, imagine that, at the highest level of our government, shocked the nation at the time. The resurgence of that truth in a post-Ferguson, post-George Floyd moment, despite the backlash we continue to face, must propel us all forward. The second truth in this report, details not in rhetoric, but in concrete policy proposals, the significant investments in communities and people that must be made to change our inequitable structures. The blueprint is as relevant today as it was in 1968. And I am grateful to the Eisenhower Foundation and to Dr. Jelani Cobb for joining us today to elevate these bold proposals that can heal our communities and our nation. But let's be clear, the Kerner report is a blueprint. As we move to designing the details and implementing the policies, it is the community voices, those who lived experiences of the problems and the potential in their neighborhoods, their cities, their states that must be lifted up, must be included in policy debates that too seldom happen and that too seldom doesn't happen. And we must invest in the civic and funding infrastructures to ensure that it does. It is the third truth proclaimed in the Kerner Commission that I urge us to really focus on, specifically those of us in philanthropy. That truth is only by building public will can our nation ever truly heal and be a place where all, and specifically Black, Brown, and Indigenous children grow up to realize their promise in loving communities where they and their families have the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to thrive. While too many things remain unchanged since 1968, I am heartened in this moment. I am heartened by the bold, courageous grassroots leaders, the movement builders, the movement building that is underway across the country. I know my friend and colleague, Zakiya Ansari, will provide powerful testimony of that. I'm heartened by the opportunities in the media. In 1968, few media outlets had even a single reporter to send to cover protests in their cities. Now we have powerful journalists like Schott Fellow and Howard University professor Nicole Hannah-Jones and Dr. Jelani Cobb, who forcefully and prominently are deepening understanding that state-sponsored violence, too often by police, and racial inequities are connected to our nation's history of slavery and legacy of segregation. And I am also heartened by changes in philanthropy. People of color are leading some of the largest foundations, like Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, LaJune Montgomery Tabron at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Bob Ross at California Endowment, but also Sharice West Scantlebury, Tanya Allen, and Mo Green are those leaders that are leading the effort within philanthropy. There now also exist robust philanthropic organizations like the Association of Black Foundation Executives, Native Americans in Philanthropy, Hispanics in Philanthropy, Asian American, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. They would have had very few or no members in 1968. And there are also white and other allies throughout the sector who are also being very intentional about investing for structural change. Tim Szilard, Greg and Maria Jobin Leeds, Josie Green, Regan Pritzker, Richard Bessemer, Sophie Fanuel, all playing critical partnership roles. Collectively, we seek the highest rate of return from our investments. And the highest return for philanthropy dollars in this moment is to accelerate public investments focused on equity and racial justice. Philanthropy simply cannot make sufficient grants to dramatically change outcomes for children and families unless we leverage our dollars in strategies to build public will, to shape public investment at the local, state, and federal level. We are all too familiar with negative, even dangerous examples of public investments. In the 80s and 90s, urban renewal forced major highways, dislocation, and devastation through communities of color. The enactment of criminal injustice reforms resulting in mass incarceration of men of color, further threatening families and community stabilities. We have opportunities now to forge public will for positive, racial equity-focused public policy. To cite just two examples before us, making a single public policy like the Enhanced Child Investment Tax Credit permanent can raise millions of children out of dire poverty. And we now have an unprecedented flow of public dollars to states and communities through the CARES Act, ARPA, infrastructure funding, and we still must move Build Back Better. But whether those dollars buy bigger versions of business or usual, or are dynamic catalysts for equitable structural change, will be determined by our intentionality, ensuring the people in the communities receiving the funds are organized and civically engaged. Investing in and empowering grassroots change organizations is also a necessary and reinforcing, I would call, virtuous cycle. Community-based organizations consistently build relationships, engage community members, and inspire them to take action. They are absolutely vital foundation of building public will and pressure to change policies and practice to direct investments. And I urge us to consider that the organizations with these ongoing relationships are more able than episodic get out the vote efforts to motivate and mobilize their community to vote. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was gravely weakened by the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court gutted the preclearance provision. And now states across the country are erecting barriers to voting. Grassroots organizations, individually in local communities, and as they are coalescing into a formidable racial justice movement, will be the source of the mass mobilization to overcome these barriers. In philanthropy, we attempt to measure what we value. And today, the data clearly illustrates the need for much greater investment in individuals and organizations and communities who are daily, against all personal and societal odds, working for our nation to finally achieve unmet promises. Just 5 days before Dr. King was assassinated, in his last Sunday sermon, which he delivered at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., titled "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution," Dr. King powerfully echoed the Kerner Commission's truth. We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will. America is definitely going through a revolution today. However, we must resist the urge of the character brought to life by Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle, who in the midst of a revolution found a quiet place in the shade by a tree and took a nap and slept through the revolution. We must resist the urge to find our less noisy spaces where we can scroll through and like the things that we like, drop in on the people we want to see, but ultimately sleep through the revolution. If we stay woke and engage, we can speed up the trajectory toward justice. I am thankful for our discussion and panelists today. And Senator Harris, I am profoundly grateful for your decades of courage and leadership. With your deep commitment to Native American and other communities, we are deeply honored to have such a wise, elder, and fierce warrior for justice in our midst. Thank you for joining the panelists in this conversation today. You are joined by racial justice advocates from across the country, young and not as young, who face great challenges, but I believe this generation is up to meet each and every one of them. Thank you. Maya, let's begin the discussion. I think you're on mute, Maya.
Thank you, John. That was a great lead in to our second panelist. In his 8 years in the US Senate, Fred Harris was a bold advocate for Native Americans and the growing civil rights movement. While in the Senate, Fred also served as the chairman of the National Democratic Committee and boldly forged 2 commissions to reform the delegate selection process that finally opened the party to diverse racial representation. When he ran for president in 1976, Fred Harris's campaign platform centered the crisis of inequality and the need for the redistribution of wealth and power. Senator Harris, the Kerner Commission and its report represented a watershed moment in history, one in which you played a leading role. We are honored to have you today to share with us that story. Welcome, Senator Harris.
Thank you very much, Maya. And now to the Kerner Commission. As you know, and as already has been said, terrible riots and violent protests exploded in the Black sections of something like 23 American cities during what came to be called the long, hot summer of 1967, with great loss of life, awful human injury, and enormous property destruction. And all of that caused a great amount of shock and fear, alarm, bewilderment, and anxiety throughout the country. The worst disorders were in Newark and in Detroit, and there the riots were not fully quelled until President Johnson called out the US Army troops. Back in that time, let's think about the date of July 27th, Tuesday, 1967, when I first became involved, or very near that time, came involved with what became the Kerner Commission. On that night, the night of the 27th of July, 1967, my wife and I and some neighbors had gathered around the television set in our living room, getting ready to watch President Lyndon Johnson on television, a telecast, which had been announced, and it was said that he was going to announce then publicly the creation of this new Citizens Commission, which became the Kerner Commission. And only about 10 minutes before the president was to come on the air, my youngest daughter, Laura, then in the second grade, came rushing in from the kitchen where we had a wall telephone. And she said, "Daddy, President Johnson is on the phone for you." That caused a little stir in the living room. I went into the kitchen, stood at attention, almost saluted, and said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." And he said, "Fred, I hope you're going to watch television tonight." And I said, "We are." And he said, "I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about." Now here, a little flashback. 3 days earlier, I had introduced in the Senate a resolution to create a Citizens Commission, a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission, to look into these riots and disorders and violent protests, not only about law and order, but in regard to the deeper causes of them. And I had that resolution, when I introduced it, assigned to my own subcommittee, the subcommittee I headed, and scheduled hearings on it for the very next morning. But at the same time, it occurred to me that the president could create this commission himself by executive order. So I called immediately the outstanding White House assistant or staff member, Douglas Cater, and told him I thought that's what the president ought to do. And he had me hand delivered a letter down to the White House to the president saying that he should do just that. And Doug then got it into the White House. The next day, I held my hearings in favor of the resolution creating the commission. And one of my principal witnesses was Whitney Young, president of the Urban League then. Now, back to my living room and the kitchen when Lyndon Johnson called. He said, as I said, "Fred, I'm going to name that commission. I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about." And I said, "I'm glad." And he said, "I'm going to put you on it." And I said, "Well, I hadn't expected that, but I'll do the best I can." And he said, "Then another thing, Fred." And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President," almost saluting again. I said, "I'll do the best I can," as I said. And then he said, "Another thing." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man." And I said, "Yes, I am a Johnson man." He said, "If you forget it, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut your blank off." He did not say blank, but he sadly, by the time our report came out, which he didn't like very much, he thought I had forgotten that I was a Johnson man. At any rate, he called the commission together for the first time by telegram, showing the urgency that he thought these matters should be dealt with. We met in the cabinet room, 11 members of us on the new commission. That included, for example, as chair, Governor Otto Kerner; as vice chair, New York City Mayor John Lindsay; 2 members of the House, 2 members of the Senate. It was a biracial and a bi-party commission. And meeting with us on that day, also showing the urgency of what we were dealing with, was, in addition to the president, the vice president, Hubert Humphrey, Attorney General Ramsey Clark, Budget Director Charles Schultz, and Cyrus Vance, the man that the president had put in charge of troops in Newark and in Detroit. The president gave us our charge, the Kerner Commission. He said he wanted us to investigate the riots and recommend action, again, not only from a law and order standpoint, but also in regard to their deeper causes. He said, "Let your search be free." He said, find the truth, and express it in your report. And that's exactly what the Kerner Commission famously did, but greatly to the displeasure, to some extent, of the president himself. David Ginsburg, our wise and really caring executive director of Washington Attorney, put together a massive operation. We contracted with the serious academic and other studies. He hired an excellent staff and a group of consultants, and they began to conduct field surveys in 23 cities, including more than 1,200 interviews and attitude and opinion surveys and other serious studies of conditions and causes. The commission itself went to work at once in the treaty room of the old executive office building. We began on August the 1st, 20 days of hearings. They ought to have been public hearings, as I advocated at the time. And those hearings went on from August 1st to December of 1967, with 130 witnesses, ranging from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And then the commission members broke into teams for site visits to riot cities and personally observed there, close up, the human cost of wretched poverty and harsh racism, including almost criminally inferior education, bad or non-existent housing, poor health facilities, and the lack of jobs. John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, and I were a two-person team, I should say, for these site visits. I had met John only at the time of the appointment of this commission, but we found out right away that we were both on exactly the same wavelength in regard to racism and poverty. And after the site visits, we continued as a two-man team to lead the work of the commission. We went, for example, to Cincinnati to meet with a group of really bright and well-educated and successful young Black men and women. They were quite militant and quite alienated. And they called what had happened in Cincinnati not a riot, but a rebellion. They didn't want to meet with us. They thought it was a waste of time. They wouldn't shake hands with us. They wouldn't even look at us. They were that hostile and alienated. And they said to us, we don't think you white politicians, people like you and John Lindsay, they said to me, are going to do anything. We don't think you really want to do anything. And we also went out on the streets in Cincinnati. And at noon that day, we ran into a group of young Black men, really typical of Black men had taken part in the riot there. And what they were doing was shooting craps down on the sidewalk. And when they saw us, John and me, we were in suits, of course. They jumped up, and one of them said to us, who are you, the FBI? And the young poverty worker who was with us explained who we were and what we were doing. And then they all said almost in a chorus to us, we need jobs, baby. Get us a job, baby. And one young man said, President Johnson got me a job last summer, but it ran out. He was talking about the summer youth program. I also, with John Lindsay, went to Milwaukee, where one of the disorders had occurred. And I spent most of a morning in a Black barbershop and talking with young Black men who came in there. Most of them had come from the South looking for jobs in Milwaukee about the time that jobs were disappearing. And the first question I asked each of them as they came in puzzled them. I asked them, do you find more racial discrimination here in Milwaukee or back in Birmingham or wherever you came from. It puzzled them because, as they finally said, in Milwaukee, they didn't even see any white people. And that indicates and told us how much segregation there was in that white city. When we came back to the Washington, those of us from the site visits, shaken, really sobered by what we'd heard and seen, we then began 44 days of writing up the report. We read it aloud, voted on it section by section, and by majority vote, we approved it. And then I should say, on some of the tougher issues we voted on, it was a vote of 6-5. For example, on the question of conspiracy, President Johnson believed that there was some overall conspiracy behind these disorders, these racial disorders. And I went down to the White House to try to disabuse him of that notion. I said to him, Mr. President, I said, the conditions where these people live are so horrible, and there is such justified hostility toward the police that almost any spark could set these disorders off. And that's exactly what happened. And the spark, in most cases, was the police. So in our report, we condemned violence and lawlessness in the strongest terms, saying that they do not bring progress, but nourish repression. And our basic and most famous finding, as you know, was, quote, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The report further stated, segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto, as we said then, a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never fully understood, and what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, and white institutions maintain it, and white society condone it. We made some progress for a while, and on the kind of strong recommendations we made to expand social programs, including unemployment and low wages, poverty, inferior and inadequate education and training, lack of health care, bad and non-existent housing, the police, the media, and so forth. And we said, although we should have emphasized this more, these recommendations applied to all Americans, rural and urban, white, black, Spanish surnamed, as we said then, and American Indians. But misinformed about the contents of the report, distracted by the Vietnam War, and pressed for money, President Johnson rejected the Kerner report and rejected our request to give us an additional 6 months to campaign for, to explain better, and to advocate our report. And I think this is particularly sad because President Johnson did more against poverty and racism than any other president before or since. Luckily, our staff had made an early deal with Bantam Books to publish the whole report on its issuance date, which was March 1st, 1968, so that there was no possibility that it could be suppressed or filed away unread, no matter what. In any event, the report was leaked to the press with intent to lessen its impact. And before the commission could, as planned, background reporters so that they would fully understand the reasons for the commission's findings and recommendations. And this leak resulted in hastily written news stories which appeared throughout the country the next morning and which carried shocking headlines, something like white racism cause of black riots, commission says. Many people never learned the rest of the story. And they didn't learn the sound basis for our findings and our recommendations. Still, as you know, a large number of important leaders spoke out in favor of the Kerner report, including Senator Robert Kennedy, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, as has been said, aptly called the report a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. The Bantam edition of the report was spectacularly popular, going immediately into 21 editions and selling millions. It helped to build a large and growing group of informed opinion leaders, what today we might call influencers, who would increasingly press for action against racism and poverty. The report also gave added confidence to African Americans in their struggle and armed them with government certified and powerful findings and recommendations. The International Association of Police Chiefs endorsed the Kerner report's recommendations for police reform, for community policing, and for more Black and other minority police officers. And similarly, the Association of Editors and Publishers endorsed the Kerner report's call for more diversity in the media and more media attention to the Black community and the discrimination and privation they faced. Unfortunately, these latter reforms faded with time. The country generally made progress on race and poverty for about a decade after the Kerner report. Legislation for open housing that had been stalled in the Senate now passed following the assassination of Dr. King, with the active backing of the Kerner Commission. With the relatively new Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, significant desegregation of housing and schools was proceeding apace. The Black-white education gap for children was narrowing at a good rate. The number of African American and Latino elected officials increased, as did their numbers in the middle class and in all aspects of American life. But with jobs alarmingly disappearing through globalization and automation, with conservative political change, and eventually with unfriendly US Supreme Court decisions, as well as congressional cuts in both taxes for the rich and the big corporations, and in programs that benefited poor and middle-class Americans, progress was slowed or stopped, and finally that reversed. And that's been the trend since the mid-1970s, and it's true today.
Thank you.
The times.
That is absolutely a great summary, and we deeply appreciate that. We are actually going to have to shift to Dr. Jelani Cobb now, but I want to hold on to your speech because I think that it's going to interweave into everything that comes next. Dr. Jelani Cobb is the Ira Lipman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University. He previously taught at Spelman College and the University of Connecticut, where he was the director of the Institute for African American Studies. He is a staff writer for The New Yorker and the author of 5 books, including the essential Kerner Commission report published last year. He was awarded the Sidney Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis Journalism, and in 2018 was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his groundbreaking journalism on Black culture, politics, and civil rights in the United States. Professor Cobb, you have a powerful voice writing about current issues of disparities, racial injustice today. Why did you want to bring the Kerner report back into focus now?
Hi, Maya, or rather, Dr. Rocky Moore Cummings. It's good to see you. It's good to be in dialogue with you. Always good to see Senator Harris, who I had the opportunity to talk to in person last fall. And I've not met Dr. Jackson before, though we have a mutual mentor in Dr. Henry Arthur Callis. And so it's really good to be in touch with everyone in this forum. And really, you know, what Senator Harris spoke about gives you all the explanation for why I thought it was important for the Kerner Commission report to come out and to be reissued. And we were looking, like everyone, in astonished horror at that agonizing, nearly 9-minute long video of George Floyd, in the course of which he lost his life, and seeing the tumultuous aftermath and the turbulence and volatility in American streets, you could just intersperse footage from 1967, 1968, and they would have been indistinguishable nearly. And so we saw these things. We also thought one of the interesting things about the Kerner Commission report, which the significance of is just so well explicated by Senator Harris, is that they were talking about the past. There's a long historical section in there that delves, really deeply into the history of the United States, the history of Black people in the United States, the history of public policy that has disadvantaged Black people in the United States, and so on, leading into the immediate past of 1965, 66, 67, and the uprisings that happened in American cities. And typically, that's what you expect a government report to do. And the overwhelming majority of government documents of this sort get created, get released, get filed, and get forgotten. You can go to the Library of Congress now and find reams and reams of government studies that have looked at one problem or another and may have held the public's interest for 15 minutes and then been forgotten. But the Kerner report was among a handful that retained resonance after it was released, and then did an extraordinary thing, became even more pertinent to the public's interests as time went on. You can only say maybe the report, the investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the 9/11 report are the only two that I can think that even have a similar trajectory. And with the Kerner report, it's not hard to see why. If we looked at what happened in Miami in 1980, in the aftermath of the police murder of Arthur McDuffie, a motorcyclist who was beaten to death by police, who then lied and said he died as a result of a motorcycle accident, and the tremendous outpouring of rage and anger in the streets for 4 or 5 days there. And then if we looked at Los Angeles in 1992, if we looked at Ferguson in 2014, if we looked at the other instances we could talk about in between there, and if we looked at this steady drumbeat, low-grade fever of conflict around policing and the way that policing has been a spark to the already desiccated kindling of our environment, of our social environments, then we see that what the Kerner Commission report said all the way back in 1968 remains pertinent. And one of the key insights, and I'll say this, we did a documentary the year that George Floyd died called Policing the Police, in which we looked at the Newark Police Department, knowing that Newark had been, in the uprising in 1967, had been one of the major examples of this, and looked at it now. It's under the leadership of an African-American mayor by the name of Ras Baraka. And in the course of doing that, one of the key insights was the mayor saying, every year I have more Black women dying in the hospital from complications of childbirth than I do who die at the hands of the police. And he said that every institution in the United States has the same values as the police. The police just have guns. And in talking about the multifaceted, interconnected, and layered ways in which institutional failure is the culprit, it's not simply a matter of policing. I think this was one of the most valuable insights that the Kerner Commission report delivered in looking at everything from housing to employment to education, and then having the brilliant insight to recognize the necessity to look at the way that media even reported on all these problems or failed to report on all these problems as part of the problem itself. And so for all of those reasons, we were looking around in that spring, that pandemic spring, amid the chaos and anger that was spilling into American streets. We thought that the Kerner report would be a valuable addition to the conversation that was happening there.
Wow, and indeed it was and continues to be a valuable contribution. Thank you, Professor Cobb. The Kerner Commission report was indeed controversial, not only for what John called truth-telling about race in the beginning, but for its detailed policy prescriptions, as Dr. Cobb just talked about, that went far beyond the programs of the Great Society. The Milton Eisenhower Foundation, whose mission is to continue the work of the Kerner Commission, has spent 50 years communicating the policies that work to achieve positive, equitable outcomes and those that don't. Dr. Alan Curtis has been the president of the Eisenhower Foundation since its founding. He is the author and editor of many books, including Healing Our Divided Society, Investing in America 50 Years After the Kerner Report, co-edited with our own Fred Harris. Alan, welcome. Can you talk about some of those policy highlights and how do we find the political will to carry out what has proven to work?
Thank you, Maya. My appreciation to John, Ann, and the Schott Foundation for this opportunity to speak with my distinguished colleagues today. And we are indebted to Dr. Cobb for his new edit of the Kerner Commission report. In Healing Our Divided Society, the 50-year update of the Kerner Commission that Senator Harris and I edited, we and our National Advisory Panel concluded in 2018 that America has made relatively little progress in reducing racial injustice, economic inequality, and poverty. As Fred has already eloquently stated, in many ways we have gone backwards. Since the Kerner Commission, public school segregation and mass incarceration of people of color have increased. Neo-Nazis have made their statements and inflicted deaths in Charlottesville. White supremacists have invaded the Capitol building. Income inequality, wealth inequality, and deep poverty has increased. The pandemic has made things disproportionately worse for people of color and the truly disadvantaged. At the same time, as the pandemic has illustrated, many Americans do not understand or do not want to understand that policy complementary to Kerner and healing priorities needs to be based on evidence and science, not on dogma and supposition. Resistance to evidence is especially disconcerting because we have learned a great deal about what works and what doesn't work since Dr. King began evolving the civil rights movement into a campaign for economic justice among all races and most classes. In that spirit, the Kerner Commission gave first priority to economic and education policy. Today, as Jared Bernstein, Joe Stiglitz, and Bill Spriggs have documented in Healing and at our Kerner forums, economic policy that works is illustrated by Keynesian demand-side capital investments in living wages and by job training, child tax credits, secure health insurance, and home leave. Sound economic policy now is based as well on vaccination, testing, and masking. Today, as John, Linda Darling-Hammond, Catherine Lehman, Marian Wright Edelman, and Diane Ravitch documented in Healing and at our Kerner forums, education policy that works is illustrated by racial integration in public schools, much more equitable financing of public schools, greatly improved training of public school teachers, significant expansion of public community schools, an end to the school to prison pipeline, and scale up of the after-school youth development, mentoring, and tutoring that now is urgently needed to help kids catch up from the pandemic. Public school integration is furthered by housing integration, and there are solid evidence-based mobility and integration successes upon which to build, for example, in the state of Maryland and the state of Washington. What works in criminal justice is illustrated by successes like California, New York, and New Jersey in significantly reducing prison populations and by proven evidence-based partnerships in which nonprofit community-based organizations in neighborhoods of color are equal partners with police to reduce crime, increase trust, and develop youth. The scaling up of these and many, many other policies that work needs to be financed in part by the scaling down of what doesn't work, like willful indifference to the unequal distribution of prosperity, like neoliberalism and Milton Friedman, and like false 1980s dogma on government being the problem. Yet America has not been able to scale down what doesn't work and to scale up what does work, because we still don't have the new will that the Kerner Commission concluded was essential for progress, as John has already framed for us so well. And so the question becomes, how can we create new will today, as Maya has asked me? To begin, we need to pass legislation based on what works. We need to communicate success better, and we need to thereby motivate citizens to vote for policy complementary to Kerner and Healing in 2022 and 2024. Otherwise, we could be cast into the wilderness for a very long time. On balance, we are off to a good Kerner and Healing beginning with the $1.9 trillion pandemic relief legislation and the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure legislation that is already passed. Through that legislation, we advanced from 2 million people vaccinated to over 210 million. Well over 6 million jobs have been created. The unemployment rate is 3.9%. Workers have been much more bargaining power than they had in decades. So this is real Kerner and Healing progress, I suggest. While holding on inflation and fixing supply side chains, we need to secure more legislation complementary to healing and to skillfully communicate its potential, motivating voters in 2022 and 2024. So for example, we need to pare down the price tag of Build Back Better, but still include child tax credits, John has said, and universal pre-kindergarten. And we need to return, I suggest as well, to Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. We need to press for evidence-based community police partnership legislation that can appeal to both Black Lives Matter and to forward-looking police chiefs. Much can already be done with the pandemic funds that have already been released. Most importantly, though, we need to create new will through passing voting rights legislation and reversing voter suppression. Last week, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act were again blocked in the Senate. At the state level in 2021, 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting, and much more suppression is coming. Such suppression of democracy and Kerner priorities is in many ways the new Jim Crow. Politicians suppressing the vote at the state level are testing the system and exploiting weaknesses to further restrict the vote of people of color. As Charles Blow has written, this is like how in Jurassic Park, the velociraptors systematically tested the fences for weaknesses. We need to acknowledge that this past year, advocacy has not been powerful and extensive enough against totally false claims of a rigged 2020 election and against totally false claims of voter fraud. Accordingly, at the federal level today, we need to be guided, as always, by Dr. King. The tragedy, he said in 1963, is that, quote, we have a Congress with a Senate that has a minority of misguided senators who will use the filibuster to keep the majority of people from voting. It's as straightforward as that. We need then to keep fighting to modify or abolish the archaic filibuster rule, a rule that is nowhere in the Constitution. We need to pass the John Lewis and Voting Rights Acts. As Dr. King forever advocated, we must never give up hope. We need to play hardball, just as President Johnson did to secure the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. Within the nonprofit sector, we need to better support and cross-endorse organizations that have been leading the way on voting rights reform and filibuster reform, like Bishop William Barber's Poor People's Campaign and the League of Women Voters. As we discussed in a Kerner and Healing event in Fred's hometown of Albuquerque that was keynoted by now Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. Nonprofit African American, Latino, Native American, and Asian American organizations need to better work together and cross-endorse one another on voting rights. We need a massive new public education campaign to better inform the American people of the state level voter repression laws that have been passed and to undo some of the damage. Major philanthropies need to finance the campaign, continuing their expansion of Kerner and healing relevant resources over the last several years. We need an energized voter registration strategy that builds on and replicates what was achieved in states like Georgia and Arizona in 2020. We need a national nonprofit and labor union campaign to register voters in 2022 and to help people in practical ways to make plans to vote and then to carry out those plans. We need to overcome the roadblocks state by state that have been created by local legislators. We need to remember how the Kerner Commission criticized the media as much as the police, and so we must regulate big tech and social media in ways that enhance the movement for voters' rights and new will. We need to listen to Bishop Barber when he reminded us at a Kerner and Healing event of how Mahalia Jackson and Aretha Franklin helped Dr. King inspire the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So too, we need new leadership today from visionaries in the visual and performing arts, like public artists Hank Willis Thomas, Kennedy Center Vice President for Social Impact Mark Lamuthi Joseph, and composer Lin-Manuel Miranda. The visual and performing arts can further the voting rights movement, can help educate Americans on the true extent of state-level voter suppression, and can connect citizens with nonprofits who can get them to the polls in 2022 and 2024.
Thank you.
These then are only a few of the ways that we can create new will, and I look forward to Zakia's wisdom for more strategies today.
Thank you. Thank you. That's awesome. I think that gives us a clear roadmap on how we can build public will. And certainly building public will also means organizing. And no one can be better to close our panel today than another fierce warrior for justice, Zakia Ansari. Zakia is the advocacy director for the Alliance for Quality Education in New York. She has been at the center of AQE's battles in the state of New York, and she is a movement builder with the Opportunity to Learn network. She is a leader forging national collaboration and action campaigns for education equity and racial justice, and currently serves on the Schott Foundation's board of directors. Zakia, we need you for the hope here. Where's the light? Hope grounded in the realities of what's happening.
All right, so
No?
so hang in there, y'all. I'm gonna stay with me.
Okay.
So Senator Harris, I was 4 months old when you got that call from the president. But also I sit here today as a 20-year in fighting for educational justice, saddened and almost angered by the fact that the same issues that you were trying to address are the ones that I am trying to address right now. It's not fair. It's not fair. And it says so much about where we're at. The Alliance for Quality Education, listen to me. This is part of the hope. For 30 years, for a 30-year battle under the Campaign for Fiscal Equity in New York State. We were started 20 plus years ago, and that was our foundation of being formulated as an organization, fighting for equity lawsuit to fully fund public schools, started by a parent who is now a senator who actually brought it home. And in the midst of a pandemic, a racial reckoning, our governor in turmoil, people in the street uprising, and a pandemic, we were able to bring that home. $4 billion over the next 3 years to Black, Brown, and poor children throughout New York State. This is the second year of the phasing of those dollars, right? But we could not have done that. I'm proud to say that the Schott Foundation is our longest funder. They were the first ones to fund us, and guess what? They are still funding us. And we could not have brought home this victory without consistency. So many times, as we are experiencing now and have experienced before, folks who do this work, we don't know if we're going to get that grant next time. We don't know if the work that we continue to fight for, whether it's restorative justice or whether it's community schools or culturally responsive and sustainable education, will be the thing that we get because we just don't know. That funding stream is so uncertain. And Schott Foundation has been sustained. We can count on them. And it has allowed us to keep pushing on and actually bring other folks on and funders on to support the work that we do. But there's so many organizations out there that don't have that. And it's not fair to do this work. As you see, we are still fighting this inequity, right? There's young people day after day, the Alliance for Educational Justice, the Urban Youth Collaborative, over and we can mention so many youth groups out there on the street, on the front lines, for many years. Many of them are now adult organizers fighting to end the school to prison pipeline. We know that one suspension for a child can increase their likelihood of dropping out by 50%. Did you hear what I said? 50. And some of our children as young as 4 years old and 5 years old are getting suspended. We're not even gonna talk about getting handcuffed, because they're doing that too in our schools, getting suspended. So the other thing that I want to acknowledge, Dr. Harris, Dr. Cobb, and also Dr. Curtis kind of brought out, right, is this moment of understanding the trauma. Trauma in Black and Brown communities is never met with a response of care and love. It is met with more control. It is met with more police, and it's met with this false sense of security around, oh, the violence that occurs, to Dr. Harris's point, is just out of osmosis. Like, it's just happening. Well, we just came out of we're not even out of it, excuse me. We're in the midst of a pandemic. Kids who were in kindergarten when this pandemic started might be in school now for the first time. They are in second grade. Our high schoolers we have experienced death. We've experienced students being unhoused. The homeless population is exploding. We have yet to meet this moment with a level of care and responsibility to address what's happening with folks emotionally, psychologically, and even physically. Instead, once again, we are saying that safety looks different. It is about criminalizing and holding on and controlling Black, brown bodies. And that is not the case. That's not where we're at. So the hope lies in the fact that we can do better. Activism absolutely is a thing. Organizing with activists is even more powerful. And we hold that line as the Alliance for Quality Education to say, people told us over and over again, don't keep asking for this money. You're not going to get it. From elected officials to folks on the ground to everyone. And if we listen to them, guess what? Black, brown, and poor children throughout this state will not have access to billions of dollars over the next 3 years. The question becomes, which to me is centered in the Kerner report, is that why, after we get a victory, are we still fighting for the accountability of those dollars and how those dollars are to be spent? That is because instead of throwing money at issue areas, we have never addressed the racism, the isms, and the phobias that exist in our society. And here we are, they have now resurfaced under the umbrella of critical race theory. So until we are really able and willing to address the racism and all the other things that exist, I'm afraid, we were joking about it before, that we might still be here the 75th anniversary talking about this. I believe in the power of we. You know why? Because at the end of the day, we as AQE saw what it looks like when you don't give up. Our communities deserve better. I have 8 children and 4 grandchildren, and I do not want to see them having to be on a panel or hearing about the Kerner Commission and how all the things they were fighting for and we haven't gotten there. The power of we can make things happen and shift and change, but we have to have conversation and communicate with each other. And the last thing I'll say is, I wear necklaces like this when I used to go into schools and organize with parents, for parents, and collectively, because it was not only to remind parents and community members that they are worthy of justice and the work that we do, it is also to remind myself, who often doubts, because this work is really physically, psychologically, and emotional abuse, to every year wake up and say, we just asking for the basics. And to once again have a system that can give money where they need to, can address the issues, but chooses not to because they're children, they're particular children. We can do better. We must do better. We have solidified a victory thanks to Schott and other foundations, and most importantly, thanks to the parents and the community members on the ground who stood with us for the last 20 plus years. They hung in there tight, talking about ride or die. They rode and died with us on this fight, and we are now in the fight for childcare and a whole host of other things. So please support organizations that are out there, youth organizations and others. Listen to the voices of parents and students and community members. We need to be closer to solutions so we can be closer. We need to be closer to the problems so we can be closer to the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakia, for your leadership. Thank you for your passion. Thank you, Dr. Jelani Cobb, Dr. Alan Curtis, Senator Fred Harris, Dr. John Jackson, for a wonderful discussion today about the Kerner Commission report and its relevance, its continued relevance today. We have a lot of work to do, and certainly our country has many challenges. And the issue of justice and equal opportunity under the law and equity is front and center. So until next time, my friends, thanks to everyone who joined us out there. Be well. Take care.
Thanks a lot, everyone.